Yeah. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Being the Best Version of Yourself podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Carey Heller. Today, we have a really awesome guest.
Well, I'm clinical psychologist, Dr. David Palmiter, practitioner, do a lot of public education. I'm a former academic. I should say a recovered academic, and I've done a lot of things in the field. And I guess relevant to this podcast is I'm also on the board of directors of the National Chat Organization.
Great. Well, and it's definitely a great organization, and we're definitely very happy to have you today.
Delighted to be here.
All right. So, guys, so let's dive right in. So, our topic today is helping parents navigate things, with their kids with ADHD at school. And, maybe we'll dive into a few other areas also. But to start with stuff for school, what would be some general thoughts you have on how parents can help, navigate stuff when their kids are struggling at school, like in terms of communicating with teachers, things like that? Because I think oftentimes a lot of parents aren't really sure where to start with that.
Yeah, I had an epiphany early in my career because I was a professional advisor, the founding professional advisor for the Southern Chicago Chat chapter. So I used to go to meetings all the time and sit in the audience as speakers did their thing. And in the Q&A, inevitably, I'd say 80% of the questions or dialogue gathered around the frustration parents had in dealing with the Chicago school systems and their child diagnosed with ADHD. And month after month, I'd hear that. And I started to think as a young psychologist that there was something deeply wrong with the Chicago public schools, at least. But then flash forward a few years and I started doing services for teachers. And there, the same thing. Most of their commentary, their concerns were voiced around what they experience to be pain in the neck parents. So parents experiencing the teachers as unreasonable, pains in the necks, and vice versa. And the more I got to know both groups, I realized that neither one often recognized the superlatively positive intention of the other group. I mean, parents, of course, most of us who are engaged with our kids love them more than their own life. And there's no better intended human beings on the planet than parents, I don't think. I don't think the Pope can touch parent intention. On the other hand, most teachers are in what they're doing out of a sense of mission. I mean, if teachers got into it to make a lot of money, they got some bad career counseling along the way. I mean, they're often mission driven, usually, and care deeply about kids. And so a first step is just to assume that nobody has to break out policies and rules and start banging gavels on tables, literal or metaphorical, that we can just go in assuming that the other person means well. I think is a good starting point.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think really important. I think along those lines, this idea of maybe of taking a collaborative approach. That if you go in with the very adversarial approach, it's probably not going to go very well. But
Right.
basically, the idea is, trying to sort of work together. Both people ideally want what's best for the child. So being able to kind of work together as a starting point sounds like can make a big difference in making things better.
Yeah. And I have, practical tips too for parents that are more specific, but a lot of those tips just depend on kind of expecting the best, really. I mean, you prepare for other alternatives, but you really do go in with an open heart and an authentic disposition. The first thing I suggest at a meeting is start with the kid's strengths. I do this in my own practice. Front loaded near the top of the interview are what are the kids' strengths, either personality strengths or skills. Because we know from research and our own clinical experience that kids have many more strengths than vulnerabilities, but often, especially kids with ADHD or defiant or bipolar, kind of stressful for adults to minister to. Often we lose track of their strengths. And so our kids, it's not like their strengths are the carnation on the mobster, right? That's often how in clinical circles, how we talk about strengths. Okay, we got a big problem here. Let's divert for a few moments and consider the strengths, carnation on the mobster. It's more like the symptoms are thorns on the rose. That's a more apt metaphor. And so I like smelling the fragrance and make sure that parents and teachers have a shared experience of what that fragrance is. So when I'm running a staff meeting and parents can do the same, you can say, do you mind if we start with Billy's strengths, what you see? I'd love to hear about that. And only when that's done, go to growth opportunities. And that's phrasing like that is how I usually like to put it. I think it's good for parents to go into these meetings. If there's any documentation that's being shared in the meetings, to have it shared up front. It's really hard to process complex information like that when you're face to face with anybody. I mean, I have a hard time talking to my spouse. If someone gave me a complicated document to read at the same time, never mind, people I have a professional relationship with or a group setting. But let me pause there, because I can quickly get too soapboxy with some of
Yeah, but
this.
I think those are really great strategies, as a starting point. That I think it really sets the stage when you're having a meeting about your child. The idea that it's not just about what is the child doing wrong. Even if the teacher has a lot of frustrations with your child because of the behavior in the classroom, the idea that it allows you to kind of reset and start by focusing on the positives and also recenter kind of the conversation. So I think for a variety of reasons, I think that's really helpful.
Absolutely. What do you find? Like, what are some of your, favorite tips to give parents as they think about going into schools?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing I like to think about is this idea that, teachers obviously have a lot of students that they're trying to work with. And so, when you're working on, trying to figure out systems or strategies for the teacher to work on with your child to make things better, one, take a collaborative approach, but also, to, be mindful of the fact that if the teacher has to do something, it's going to take a lot of extra time. They probably don't have that extra time. And then they may become resentful. So the idea of figuring out like what is the end goal. So if the end goal is figuring out how do you get information to the parent about what's been going on at school to better guide things, whether it's for the therapist or for someone else, then the thing to figure out is what is the teacher willing or able to do that's realistic and not too time consuming in order to get that information. So like one of the things I do a lot would like as I work with is basically we'll set up like a Google Doc with the teacher, and the teacher will quickly fill in a couple notes here and there in a chart, and then the parents can see it, I can see it, and then it's great because we have a clear record of what happened. Because the other problem is when you're trying to work on these things, if you don't get a whole lot of information and either your child comes home and says something or the teacher gives some real basic information, you don't always have a sense of what was the trigger, like what happened in that moment that led to whatever the behavior was. So you may just get a thing, oh, so and so did X, Y, or Z, but you have no idea what happened before then and why. And so sometimes having that chart in organized fashion can make it much easier to better understand things and in turn then figure out how to make things better.
I think that distinction is so important, goals versus methods, because sometimes I've seen relationships between schools and parents deteriorate over methods. And when multiple methods could be fine reaching the same goal. So to say, like, what are we trying to do? What's the accomplishment? For kids that have behavioral challenges in the classroom, it's common for me to set up, a daily behavioral report card where the teacher gives grades, takes them 2 seconds. And that's then tied to a behavioral program at home. I've got into some schools and they've not wanted to do that way. They say, we have this other notebook or we have this electronic format where I'm like, fine. I don't care if the information comes home on a sneaker, as long as it's available. So I think that methods versus goal, to ask, is this a method or a goal we're talking about? I find parents and teachers can get on the same page about goals pretty quickly.
Yeah, and no, I think it's definitely a really important point. And I think also another piece of it is, we're thinking about any sort of system to really look at what's actually realistic for the child to do themselves or be involved with, and also what's realistic for the teacher. Like, so for example, if we think about assignments, that for a child of who has a real hard time executive functioning, there's certain things that teachers may expect of them that may be very hard for them to do. Like if they're expected to, I don't know, take a piece of their homework, take it out of their folder and put it in a box at a certain time without any sort of reminder. Again, the hope would be that they can learn over time to be able to do that, but they may need more extra support in order to sort of do that. And so I think figuring out a fine balance between what what maybe would be expected that the child do versus where that individual child may need some extra help.
And this is where I think expert consultation is so, so helpful, because we engage parents, we're crazy people because of how much we love our kids. It's almost like the love we have of our kids is too big for our corporal bodies to manage, to handle it. I know when my eldest was born 30 years ago, when she sucked on my little finger in that delivery room, I had the feeling of pain, like my cells were breaking apart at a cellular level, like I lost my capacity to breathe. And it was all this love, and it makes us crazy. So having an outside person um, who doesn't, who's concerned, who's empathic and expert, but doesn't have that crazy love can really be helpful to find us the middle ground. Because if we go in too hot and hard with impractical strategies, then we just lose the teacher and they start telling us about how many kids they have in the classroom. For me, by the way, whenever you're in a meeting and a teacher starts telling you about how many kids they have in the classroom. That's a symptom. Something's wrong. It's like a fever in a pediatric practice. There's something, either the teacher's burned out, the asks are unreasonable, there hasn't been a human connection made between parents and teachers. But think of that as a symptom. The same thing if people start quoting rules and laws. That's another symptom that something else is wrong.
Yeah. Well, and again, I think you also have to think about what are some of the other factors involved in these situations. So certainly, depending on the school or the school system, sometimes teachers get weary of, the parent can take some sort of legal action or some sort of, good administration if I don't do so. So like, I think sometimes that can, lead to teachers being, hesitant to share more information about what's going on or to be as willing to sort of do certain things. So again, I think you have to sort of look at the bigger picture, sort of everything together and how that plays in. But I think your point earlier about this idea of being able to kind of separate kind of your emotions from the situation to be able to take that step back and have someone that can sort of really evaluate what actually makes sense for this child in this situation and are these real your expectations realistic. I think both for the teacher with the child, but also obviously for the parents and what they want the teachers to implement for the child.
Right. And, I often, I'm sure you do the same thing in an evaluation for a child, ask teachers to call our rating scales. I mean, it's so important. And, the parents, the job of the type of vocation, if a parent has this vocation, they're much more likely to give me a hard time about having teachers fill out rating scales. You want to take a wild guess at what that vocation is?
Being a psychologist or mental health professional.
Teachers. Teachers. And in services, the number one complaint I hear about people like you and me is we don't involve them enough. We don't use their expertise in it. So here I am doing it. And the teachers, parents who are teachers are least like the ones I've got to convince the most. And the number one reason they say is they're concerned about the gossip. And I've had so many of my former students placed in schools doing trainings. We have to do a lot of work on all the bonding that occurs over trashing parents. Now, there's often good reasons why the teachers are upset, but that is such a common experience. So, any parents listening, you and I both appreciate that, like any relationship, there has to be good work on both sides. And that could be something, if a parent's listening, you feel like, geez, I'm only do my part. The teachers seem to have traveled a rough road and now things aren't working well. You could suggest an in-service on how to facilitate relationships with parents. Either of us could be happy to, help with a new service like that for schools.
No, because I think that's a really important thing is that, if teachers, if you don't really have the resources you need to be able to support a child, asking for help is really crucial. Whether it's a formal
Absolutely.
in service, more of an informal consultation, but also being able to, if you have the ability to, connect with professionals that the child works with outside of school. Because I think that's a lot of times, I mean, I would venture to guess that the frequency of therapists having a direct, contact on a regular basis with the teacher, even when there are issues going on, is probably not ridiculously high, or probably not as high as it could be. And in turn, because I find it really helpful because then teachers tell me exactly what's. I mean, usually I find if kids are really struggling, the teachers are kind of at their wits' end. Sometimes they're more willing to talk because then they want the help, so they really benefit. But I do think that again, sometimes it depends on the rules and the parents' willingness to allow that contact. But I think when feasible, that does really help in a lot of cases because the sharing of information allows everyone to know what's going on more to in turn help the child better.
A topic for another podcast could be, what is a good evidence-based evaluation for a kid on an outpatient basis look like? One that considers both um, gathering the right information, but also cost and time. In Pennsylvania, when I was president of that association, we had a 3-year project where we developed standards like that. And it goes to one of the things you said. You're right. Most mental health professionals and survey research I've done do not collect teacher rating scales, do not get teacher input, and do not go into schools and meet about a particular kid. And that's serious problems. I mean, we need to be collaborating with the systems that the kids lives in.
Yeah. And then, one thing I'll say for those of you listening out there is that if you're having testing completed for your child to better understand what's going on, in general, it's very helpful to get the teacher input. But on a practical level, if you're interested in getting accommodations at school, if you go and give that report to the school, I can tell you from experience of seeing this, if you don't let the provider talk to the schools come back to you and say, that you have this report, but you didn't actually get our input on what we see, and that oftentimes can slow down the process of getting accommodations because then they want to do their own testing or some sort of informal evaluation because you didn't get any direct input from school. So that's why it is really vital to let the clinician who's doing the testing actually interact with teachers and get that information from the school start, because it oftentimes makes it a lot easier to get a better, more accurate understand what's going on. But on a practical level, will probably make it easier towards getting accommodations if that's what we're looking to best support your child.
I think a lot of teachers have lost their sense of power. They have such power. Listeners, if you want to Google, I'm going to block on the name, but if you just Google drummer, teacher, it's Mr. something or other, or email me later, I can tell you, but it's a good quick YouTube video on the power teachers have. My son, my only son, I've got three kids, two girls, a boy, is named after a former teacher, and it doesn't take a lot of time, and the impact can be so incredibly transformative. But if I'm a teacher and I don't see that, I don't see that in myself, and I'm consistently asked to do important things that are outside my control, it's going to make me nuts. I mean, that's, if you were an evil behavioral scientist, that's the script, right? Give a human being a sense of responsibility for something important and make sure they don't have the resources to realize it. It's not long till you go crazy. This is why the Serenity Prayer is a part of any recovery program, because it's the antidote to that. And I think a lot of teachers could really use the Serenity concept.
Yeah. And I think another point kind of related to this is I was just thinking about this with ADHD is that, certainly you have the kids that are really disruptive in the classroom and the teachers often want help. But, at the same time, you also have a lot of kids that, are struggling, but if they're not being disruptive, can fly under the radar a lot more. So probably one things I hear when I'm doing evaluations is the idea that, parents often recognize there's an issue going on, but the teachers don't always do. And so I think it's important to recognize that even if a teacher says things are fine, it doesn't always mean that they truly are. There may be things that the teacher's not seeing. I mean, my favorite example, and again, I think this is probably a very nice teacher that I think, meant well and probably, I think did pay attention. But basically, years ago, I did a classroom observation for a teenager. And basically, so I observed the student in the classroom. And granted, I think because of where he was sitting in the classroom, it's probably hard for the teacher to see. But, I asked the teacher after, when I interviewed her, does this child have a hard time sitting still? And she was like, oh, no, he sat perfectly still. I just watched him like basically squirm in his seat the entire time. But I think because of the positioning and the fact that you probably couldn't see his legs shaking as much based on where he was sitting in the classroom, I think she didn't notice it. But I'm sharing that with the idea that I think even if teachers have the best of intentions, they can't always see everything.
Exactly right. Yeah, I agree with that. And they have so much power. And when a teacher is firing on all cylinders, they know there's lots of things outside their control, but they're still keep going and they still have these transformative impacts on kids. In one book of adults diagnosed with ADHD in children, it's called Hyperactive Children Grown Up. They followed these people into early adulthood, mid to late 30s, and they asked them, those that were doing well, in your opinion, what in your background best put you in this position to be doing well? And I don't remember the entire list, but on the short list of that was a teacher believed in me. And they couldn't even necessarily remember what subject the teacher taught, but they remembered the impact. And it didn't take a lot of time either. It's
Well, I think it goes to show sort of the value of a good teacher or a good role model, and like a sports coach or some sort of other extracurricular activity teacher that can have a meaningful impact on a child. And I think those are things that for those of you that are listening, I'm sure probably all adults. If you think back to your own childhood, if you had people in your life like that, it can really make a big difference.
Could I fire off a couple quick tips for parents for these
Sure, go
meetings?
for it.
One is I would attend all conferences. That's something we do as parents. Like teachers, sometimes we don't necessarily think that there's work to be done if a kid isn't being a pain in the neck. So I would go to all conferences and both parents whenever possible. Sometimes it's not. There's a lot of single parenting and two parent households going on. I'd show up a little early. I'd take notes. I'd try to be very open to any challenging feedback. And I would follow up with a thank you card or a thank you email. And in that email or card, just say the things you heard that you agreed to. I would also affirm any aspect of the teacher's approach or behavior that are worthy of it. I mean, for a parent to say, listen, my son came home last week and he told me that you wrote his name on the board because he turned in such a geography report. I'm telling you, that was more powerful for him than us spending 3 hours telling him how much we love him. I mean, stuff like that for a lot of teachers is like akin to petting a cat under its chin. I mean, they're just so starved for that accurate, positive feedback. I would try not to make any disparaging remarks about anybody. Um, and, I guess I feel like I'm forgetting some things, but those are the ones come to mind right.
No, I think these are all really great strategies that I think, hopefully a lot of people can really benefit from hearing and implementing.
Yeah.
Because I think the idea also, I mean, certainly for kids, hearing the praise is really important. But I also think sort of showing the appreciation to teachers can go a long way. Because if it's one way where you want stuff from them, but don't really get, but don't sort of thank them or praise them, when they're doing, I think even though they don't do it probably for that, it still can have, really go back to what we were talking earlier about this idea of the relationship. And in a lot of ways, having that sort of mutual reciprocity really helps in terms of the building that relationship between the parent and the teacher.
And you said something very important a few minutes ago, that I find is true of a lot of parents, that if the teacher hasn't told them that everything's okay. While that's true of your top of the bell curve teachers, for most, the number one referral source in children for mental health is being a pain in the neck. That's the quickest referral source. The number one diagnosis among kids, as you know, are anxiety disorders, but they follow a distant fourth in referral rates because anxious kids don't bug people. Girls are less likely to bug people. And so that's why girls are way under-identified compared to boys for ADHD. There's some problems with how we do the evaluations too of girls that need to be addressed, but some of it is too that they're not bothering anybody. Hair down, head down, hair and face, head down, zoned out because of ADHD maybe, sitting in the back, not bugging anybody. Nobody's raising it as an issue. You probably have had a lot of adult women in your practice over the years, like I have, who are very angry about that. And I had one woman in her mid 30s got evaluated by me, started on a stimulant. The following week was so euphoric. She said, I feel like I've been a horse and the blinders have just dropped and now I can see the universe. Dr. Dave, I sat in my bathtub and read a book for a half hour. You don't understand. I've never read for longer than 10 minutes. I could do a whole half hour. I could have kept going if it weren't for the kids knocking on the door. A week later, depressed, angry. Why wasn't this recognized earlier? Everybody, the teachers, my parent, everybody let me down. I wanted to be a nurse. I thought I was stupid, right? So we do well keep this in mind that how's my kid getting along with other kids? How engaged are they in the class? What's the quality of their homework? What do you think their effort is like? What's their relationship with you? So if those questions are answered well, now I can feel confident there's not a problem that needs to be addressed.
Right. But I think right. And it also brings up the point, though, that if you have concerns, at least, doing some sort of consultation with someone to talk through stuff is good, right? Because for a lot of the stuff, it's much easier to intervene early rather than letting it go. So it's that fine balance between figuring out, is there an issue going on? But to sort of also sometimes seek the professional consultation, even if they come back and say, oh, your child seems to be functioning fine, we don't see anything, at least then at least in that present time, that things seem fine.
Yes.
Because I think there's a lot of people where it's often this, here's a crisis, so we're going to seek support. And then, oh, it seems like it's better now, we'll let it be. And, and sometimes that's fine and it was a temporary thing. But other times, the same issue is always there. It just doesn't always manifest itself quite as explicitly.
Yeah, well said.
So, so definitely a lot of different, parts to this. And, it's always important to kind of, look at if your child is struggling in some way, sitting back and just letting it be is usually not the best strategy. I mean, you don't want to overdo it either, but the idea is at least start to figure out, is this more of a long-term issue that needs to be addressed? Who's the right kind of person to talk to? And so in a lot of cases, sort of pediatrician might be a good starting point, or a school counselor, to just, have someone as a starting point to say, this is what I'm seeing. Sort of who might be a good professional to contact based on this.
And you know the science like me, it's a good news, bad news story. On the one hand, the good news is the evidence-based approaches that are available have whopping positive effects on children. The statistic we use most, as you know, is effect size. And zero point 0.8 is considered to be like whopping effect. And the effect size for science-based child interventions goes between 0.7 and like low 0.8s. So it's whopping. On the other hand, most kids who could use a mental health evaluation don't get one. Imagine we were in the early part of the 20th century and you're a dentist and you're still at dentistry and you have all these people walking around going, oh, this tooth really hurts. It's so painful. I don't know what I'm going to do. You're like, haven't you heard of dentistry? Like, we can do a lot for your tooth. I think sometimes we're still that way about kids because most kids, think of this as true of our kids' dental health, that most kids with a dental problem don't get care. And when they do get care, they've usually suffered for 2 years before they get it. And then most of that care is not science-based. Imagine those things were true of our kids' dental health. Images of us walking around with their knuckles dragging on the ground come to mind, like caveman culture. Yet those are exactly the accurate statistics for our children and their mental health. Most kids by age 18, 90% will have had at least a mild mental health problem, making it like physical problems. That's the same thing that's true of physical problems. Over 90% of kids will have a physical problem. Most of them are mild. But unlike physical problems, the mental health problems don't get attention, even though the treatments are available that can be short term. I mean, enough. For parents listening, let's not have your baby be one of those people. Let's have your baby get the attention that he, or they need.
Right, no, exactly. I mean, because think about it that, if your child's struggling in school with a civic academic subject, there's a good chance maybe you look at some sort of tutoring or some sort of extra support. If they're struggling with sports, in some cases, maybe you get them some sort of class to take or private coaching. So in the same way, if your child's struggling with their mental health, working with a therapist can really make a huge difference and really set them up, for long-term success and help them be happier.
And I wish it was ethical for us to create video montages of kind of before or after and just the short number of months it takes to accomplish that. I mean, just this week, I had two parents in my office crying with tears of gratitude. It's not like I'm some special wizard on my clinical skills. It's just practicing science based. And there's so many of us out there that do that. And it can be just so incredible. It's like a rebirthing. As men, we'll never give birth, but we've given rebirth more times than we can count. Feels like stars in the sky.
Well, it's essentially like it can be like a new outlook on life. That the idea that some child's been struggling with something, even if they don't know what it's like in the past not to have struggled, suddenly that wake up call of being able to suddenly they're less anxious, they're able to function better, they sort of don't know what it's like to not feel anxious, and it's become sort of a positive experience. Those are things that really can impact in terms of increased success with school, sports, being able to sort of grow up, be independent as an adult, have a good job, all that stuff. You sort of have to get in order for them to launch successfully and really be, thriving adults. It often starts in childhood in terms of making these positive changes and addressing issues when they pop up. And again, you can have kids that, may be fine in some, like, let's say in childhood and then hit the teenage years and things start to, kind of go awry, or you could have, here these little things here and there that just kind of keep building. So, but the point is that if your child is struggling with something, don't just sit back, figure out, who might be the good or the right kind of professional based on what the struggle is, and at least ask someone, even if you make a phone call to someone and say, this is what's going on, does this make sense for you to work with them? Then, at least know that, maybe to say, oh, let's do a consultation, or maybe say, based on what you're saying, maybe it would be good to work with an OT or a speech therapist. But at least then you get the right direction of where to go to help your child in the way that you're trying to, seek out.
So there's a couple of resources I could point to on my blog, hecticparents.com. I have an article that lays out what quality child mental health care looks like, the elements to look for. So a lot of those you can figure out on an initial phone call if a practitioner does certain things. And then in my parenting book, Working Parents, Thriving Families, I sometimes forget the name of my own darn book. There's an entire chapter devoted to how to be an educated consumer about mental health care for kids.
Yeah, well, this definitely sounds like a great resource. So, all right. Well, this was great. It was definitely a good conversation. I hope it was really helpful to all of you out there listening. And I guess, where can people find you? So if they want to reach out to you directly, I'll put all the stuff in the show notes, but where are the best places that they can reach?
It's easy to remember, helpingfamilies.com. So all my contact stuff is there. I'm in the process of upgrading the website, so my social media will be connected there too shortly. But helpingfamilies.com.
All right, great. Well, thanks again for coming on today. Thanks to everyone out there for listening. And if you like this episode, definitely like it, and share it with a friend who might benefit. And definitely follow us on social media, on YouTube and Instagram. So this way you can stay abreast of all the upcoming episodes that come out as well.
Do you
Take
want
care,
to?
everyone.
I also, in close, I'll share that I'm also a magician. So in my practice, I work a lot with magic with kids. And for those just listening, I just ignited my wallet. And the big burst ball of flame came out of my everyday wallet.
That is really cool.
Just a little splash.
Yeah, and the humor and kind of light is definitely a great way to kind of boost mood and keep things lively.
Thanks, Dr. Heller.
You're welcome.